Hello, I'm Carrie Ann. Welcome to another service with Pastor Ray Dieter at Grace Baptist Church. Our website, gbcevansville.org. There, you'll find videos of our youth and children's services, daily devotions, and other ministries our church has to offer.
Well, good morning. How are you? Well, it's good to be back in Indiana. Been in Richmond, Virginia this week at a meeting of the IMB Board of Trustees, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Interesting trip. A lot of things going on at IMB, and all of them good. And so we're encouraged about that. And things are beginning to open back up so we can send some folks. At one point, we had over 1,280 of our missionaries in the United States because they were out of the countries they were in because of the COVID, and now they're beginning to filter back in some of those places, but not in Central Asia because it's the disease is very rampant there. I'd ask you, for the first time, Joanna is watching on live stream. Hello, how are you? Are you drinking coffee and eating donuts while you're watching? I just wonder. She did not do well on the trip, and her legs are swollen, and she couldn't hardly get out of bed this morning. Had to lift her and help her, so I made an executive decision, which she agreed with, and so she's staying home resting today. Well, the next 2 Sundays, we're going to be talking about 2 widows and 2 prophets, and you might get a little confused next week, but I hope not. Today we're going to talk about Elijah, and next week we'll talk about Elisha. And I want us to look today at the 17th chapter of 1 Kings. And the first thing you see here actually begin in the 16th chapter, where it talks about an evil, evil man, Ahab. In the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, Ahab the son of Omri became king over Israel, and Ahab the son of Omri reigned over Israel in Samaria 22 years. Now Ahab the son of Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. How'd you like to have that said about you? The worst one yet. More evil than any king to this point. And it came to pass, as though it had been a trivial thing for him, to walk in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, that he took a wife, Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and he went and served Baal and worshipped him. So he married a foreign woman, which was prohibited for the kings of Israel to do. That was Solomon's downfall. And he married Jezebel. And man, now, you think he's bad. She's worse than he is. She's an evil, evil woman. Then the word of the Lord came to him. Then he set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal, which he had built in Samaria. And Ahab made a wooden image Israel to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. So he lets his wife convince him. He's not a spiritual leader in his home, it's obvious. He lets his wife convince him to worship her God. And so he sets up this altar to worship Baal. And things really descend into darkness from there for he and the queen. And so God, being displeased with up a man named Elijah. And in the 17th chapter, it says, Elijah the Tishbite, the inhabitants of Gilead, said to Ahab, as the Lord God of Israel lives before whom I stand, there shall not be dew or rain on all these years except by my word. Now, one of the things you have to listen to understand about Ahab, here comes this young prophet, Elijah, and he speaks to him, and Ahab has no regard for him. He's not somebody he even knows. He's not important. He doesn't come from a major family. He doesn't come from a major tribe. He doesn't come from a major place in the land. And so the king is really paying him no never mind. He just said, who is this guy that thinks he can come in here and he claims he's speaking for the God of Israel, and who does he think he is? But Ahab has ignored all of the leanings that go. He finally sends a prophet in person to him to speak to him. And he sends this young man, and the thing that you love about Elijah is that he came from an unknown family, from an unknown place, but he listens to the Lord. It says, then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, get away from here and turn eastward and hide in the brook Cherith, which flows. Tells him, first of all, you go in and you tell Ahab that because of his sin, there's going to be a drought in the land. Now, this is an agrarian land. It's important. Crops are important. Herds are important. And so you go in and tell him there's not going to be any rainfall, there's not going to be heavy dew, there's not going to be anything until you, Elijah, say so. Can you imagine that? So he goes to the king and he tells him, look, it's not going to rain, it's not going to do anything till the Lord listens to me and I tell him to make it so. And so there's going to be drought in the land. Now, of course, that doesn't make Elijah very popular. And so first thing God tells him is that you need to get out of here for now. You need to flee. You need to make a hasty exit. Get away from here, he says, and turn eastward and hide by the brook. And so he went and did according to the word of the Lord. For he went and stayed by the brook Cherith, which flows into the Jordan. So there's this beautiful bubbling brook bringing up good, fresh, cold water out of the earth. And it flows down a stream and into the Jordan. And God tells the prophet, you go there. You camp out by that brook, and I'll take care of things. And when he gets there, what God does is he has the water flowing from the brook, which is fresh and good, spring water, if you've ever had good spring water to drink. But also, God commands the ravens to bring him bread and meat in the morning. Now, where they got it, I don't know. It's a God thing. But every morning, the ravens would bring him breakfast. How'd you like that? Served him breakfast right by the brook. And then in the evening, they would bring bread and meat again. And so the prophet was well cared for. God was looking out for him. He had plenty to eat. He was able to rest. He was hidden from Ahab and his vindictive wife Jezebel. And God is just looking out for him and taking care of him while the king and the queen do not repent, do not return. But then something happens, and that's where we want to sit down for a moment today in the 7th verse. And that it happened after a while that the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. Everything was going smooth. Elijah had a nice place. He was comfortable there. He was protected there. And he had this good fresh water, and the ravens were bringing him sustenance every day. And then all of a sudden, the brook dries up. That's an amazing thing, really. We used to live on a lake. Our son lives there now, 18-acre lake that was fed by 3 springs. And even when everything else around in our community was drying out and there was droughts going on, that lake was always full and overflowing because those springs just kept bringing water and bringing water and bringing water. And even though we went through some drought periods, I never saw one bad enough that the lake wasn't fed by those 3 springs. But now, here's Elijah. He's been taken care of, but the brook has dried up completely. And the interesting thing as we look at Elijah, I want you to see, is that when this happens, there's no panic in Elijah's life, all right? You know, human nature is that, my gosh, what am I going to do now? The water's gone. It's dried up. What happened? Where did it go? How come it's not coming forth? I wonder if the ravens will come in the morning. I wonder if they'll come tonight. Worry, worry, worry. We were in Virginia this week, and many of you have seen on the news the pipeline incident where the Russian people have attacked this company, cyber attack, and the pipeline was shut down. And all through Virginia and along the East Coast, that is fed by the pipeline, and there was mass panic where we were. Everybody was worried about having enough gas. I had people, when they'd say, where are you from? I was in one restaurant, and the guy said, oh, you visiting with us? I said, yeah. He said, when did you get here? I said, today. He said, where are you from? I said, Indiana. He said, you think you'll be able to get home? I said, yeah, I think I'll be able to get home. Well, do you think you'll be able to find gas? And station after station, we would drive by it, and they'd be closed. Or they'd have a sign, we have diesel only. Or that one station, they were lined up so far out of the station, it wound around and down the side of the road, and this got dangerous. It was winding down the off-ramp on the interstate. People were pulling in that off-ramp and in line to come around and get gas. And there was just mass panic. And the more the news told them, there's plenty of gas, folks. You don't have to do this. The longer the line seemed to be. And so the day before we were to leave to come home, about about 3 o'clock, we got done with our afternoon session, and I thought about these lines, and people get off work and then they go get in line to get gas. So I went about a mile from where we were meeting the church there, and there was a Vallejo station, and I pulled in there, and they had everything taped off but the 87 grade. They were out of everything but that. But when I pulled in, I pulled right to the pump, and a little lady pulled up on the other side of the pump, and we started pumping, and we were just kind of talking like you do. You see people at the gas pumps, and said, why in town? And I told her that I'd been down to that church, and we were talking. And all of a sudden she got done. She said, it was nice talking to you. And she went to get in her car, and she said, how are we going to get out of here? And I said, what are you talking about? She said, well, we've been visiting. You haven't been paying attention. And I looked up, and we were parked in. I counted 30 cars in line coming in from all directions to the gas pumps. Everybody got off work, and they went to buy gas. And they were parked behind me, and then they were parked in front of me. And finally, another fellow who was at a pump over there, we had to go and tell people, look, you can't get gas till we leave, and we can't leave till you do something. Do you ever try to get people to coordinate themselves and back up? One lady said, well, I hate to back up. I might lose my place in line. I said, well, and another guy said, I don't know what about the guy behind me. And I said, you start backing up, and he's going to back up. I'll tell you that. It was just mass panic for apparently no reason, because the gas was only $2.99. And if there was a real shortage, the price would have been $3.49, $3.59, $3.69, Elijah looks at the brook, it dries up, but he doesn't panic. He trusts the Lord. He waits on the Lord. One of the things about dry brooks in our lives is that they teach us spiritual lessons. We all go through periods when it feels like the brook has dried up. Maybe there's not enough money in the account to pay this month's electric bill or this month's water bill. Maybe there's not I've run out of my prescription early, and I can't get to the pharmacy, and when I do, they're out, and they say it'll be 3 days before I get it. Sometimes it feels like my prayers are not going beyond the ceiling, and I'm praying and praying, and nobody's listening, it seems like. And we all get in those sessions in our lives when we're walking in the dry brooks. And what we have to understand is that sometimes in the midst of the dry brook, God teaches us spiritual lessons. He is teaching Elijah, and Elijah is already learning, I can trust God in this whole matter. He has called me to speak to Ahab. I'm in physical danger probably, but I can trust the Lord. And he says, look what God has done. He used ravens to feed him. Now, a raven is an unclean bird. A Jewish person in Elijah's day was not to touch a raven. In fact, you'd never keep a raven around the house as a pet. You wouldn't feed the ravens in your yard, so you'd come around. You avoided ravens because they were considered unclean. But here's God using this unclean fowl, this bird, to bring food to Elijah. And what does Elijah do? He doesn't say, what are you doing, God? This bird's dirty. This bird's unclean. No, he don't argue with God. He says, thank you, Lord, for what a provision this is. Fresh bread every morning. Meat. Fresh bread and meat in the evening. As he trusts God, the brook is dried up, and God says, here, pay attention, I'm going to do something else. And what he tells him, he says, arise and go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. See, I have commanded a widow. So he arose and went to Zarephath. And when he came to the gate of the city, indeed a widow was there gathering sticks. And he called her, and he said, please bring me a little water in a cup that I may drink. And as she was going to get it, he called her and said, please bring me a morsel of bread in your hand. And she said, as the Lord your God lives, I do not have bread, only a handful of flour in a bin and a little oil in a jar. And I am gathering a couple of sticks that I may go home and prepare them for myself and my son. Now, he tells him, I've got this widow lady, and you need to go and you'll meet her there. Now think about, the ravens are unclean. The widow lady is not Jewish. She's a woman, and she's not of his people. She's a Gentile. So God has used this unclean raven to feed him, and now he's sending him to a woman that he would generally have nothing to do with. He wouldn't speak to her on the street. He wouldn't associate with her in any way. And God says, you go see this widow. I'm using her, and you have to depend on her. So he finds the widow on the street, and he asked her, can you get me a cup of water? And she said, sure, I can get you a little water. He said, how about making me a little something to eat? And she says to him, the only reason I'm out here is I'm getting some sticks to start a fire, and I'm going to cook what little bit of that I just sit back and my son are going to die. Can you imagine her desperation? One of the things I read about this week was a family in India that one of our missionaries went to visit, and they found dead. They were day laborers, which means they work a day, they get paid a day, and then they buy their food for the next day. And they had not been able to work for 2 or 3 weeks because of the COVID. And finally, they took what little food they had, and they put poison in it, and they poisoned their children and themselves because they couldn't face the eventuality of starving to death. They didn't know the Lord. Elijah doesn't panic. He doesn't say, what are you doing, God? Why did you say this? She's got nothing over here. That's not what he does. God's told him there's provision here, and his trust in the Lord is complete. He said, here's what you do. And Elijah said to her, do not fear. Go and do as you have said, but first, and bring it to me, and afterwards make some for yourself and your son. For thus says the Lord God of Israel, the bin of flour shall not be used up, nor shall the jar of oil run dry until the Lord sends rain on the earth. Elijah says, you go home to feed me, and you feed yourselves, and tomorrow there'll be enough to feed you and your son and me. His trust in the Lord is complete. He says, I know you got a little. I know you're desperate. You go do this. This is what God has commanded. And so she does. And in the midst of this, God is revealing himself not only to Elijah. Elijah can trust him completely in all things and rely on his providence and his provision, but he's also ministering to this woman, this widow. She speaks to him of your God. She doesn't say my God. She doesn't say the God. She says your God. She's a worshiper, multi-gods. And yet, in the midst of this, God is using her, and he's going to use Elijah in her life in wonderful ways to draw her to himself. And so the thing to remember from this, when you're in the midst of the dry brook, is there's no panic ever in heaven. God always has a plan. He is a planner, not a panicker. Nothing catches him. He sees all of it that's coming, and he knows what's going to happen no matter what decisions leaders make, even though he knows what decisions they're going to make. And Elijah, at this point in his life, is just overwhelmed by the provision of God through the ravens in him completely. And he tells her, you go home, we're not going to run out. Now that's a bold statement. That'd be like me telling you, if you say you had $1,000 in your bank account, and I'd tell you, now tomorrow go draw that 1,000 out and get what you need, and the rest of it give to the capital campaign. And even though it says zero in the evening, in the morning when you go, your bank, there's going to be $1,000 in there again. So you draw that 1,000 out. I wish I was a prophet, I'd tell you that. We'd get the capital campaign going. But the point here is that he is telling her something that is literally impossible. You can't use flour and not run out. But he says you're not going to run out. And he has learned in the midst of this to trust God, and he is going to use this all for her to understand God. Sometimes the dry brooks are in our lives that we might learn to trust him more and more and more for his protection and his provision. And sometimes the dry brooks in our lives are there to others. Remember a story a friend of mine told about a young couple expecting their first child. And the doctor come out to the father, and he said, this is a difficult delivery. We're going to have to do a C-section. The father said, I'll sign anything. And he came out a little later, and he said, we've delivered the baby, but I'm sorry to tell you that the baby... Afterwards, he went in to see his wife. She had not seen the child yet. And the father said to his wife, God has blessed us. He trusts us enough that he gave us a Down syndrome child. In the midst of the dry brook, to the doctor, the nurses, and everyone that came in contact, that child was loved and cherished and valued because he sometimes in the midst of the dry brook, people are watching us to see how we react and we don't even realize it. But how we react in the midst of the dryness is a testimony to trust him immensely, intensely, and completely. A second lesson that we learn from dry brooks is that God guides us one day at a time. Her flour and oil were like the manna of Israel. Each day, it says, that she went, and there was more. God didn't give her a week's supply at a time. He gave her a day at a time. Like the manna that the Israelites ate in the wilderness, he gave them, except before the Sabbath, they gave him twice as much so they didn't have to go out and gather on the Sabbath. And one of the things we need to understand in our lives is that we need to trust God in those places, and that sometimes the information he gives us is not limited. It is not satisfactory even. You know, I've talked often here about the fact that we had a little stillborn granddaughter, and I'll never understand in a world where children are abused why a good Christian couple would lose a child before she was even alive in this world. I'll never understand that. But yet, in the midst of it, God tells me, you just need to trust that that was what was best in that situation. And you need to lean on my grace in the midst of that. And you see, the lesson that he's learning is every day oil. Every day there's going to be flour and oil. Monday, flour and oil. Tuesday, flour and oil. Wednesday, flour and oil. All week long. And what we need to understand in our lives is there are going to be things that bother our heart and our soul that we don't understand. But the point is, I don't need to know answers if I know Jesus Christ. I need to know as I go. Remember what he said to Abraham? He said, get up and go to a place that I will show you. There's the route. You know, I got on my phone and put the route in, and it showed me all how to, didn't have to do that. You just trust him in the place where you're going. And sometimes we need to understand that God speaks to us on a need-to-know basis. And a lot of times there's things that we, in the great scheme of things, we think we need to know, but we don't. Okay? We don't. We just need to trust him, especially when the brook is dry. It's not time to go wandering off for the brook in search of water. It's time to wait on God to give you the direction to go. You know, go hunting. God says, you go find this widow. And he followed what God told him. Third, dry brooks are often a sign of God's blessing rather than this seventh verse. Listen to this. And it happened after a while that the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. The dry brook is because his prayers have been successful. He said to God, don't let it rain till I say it's going to rain. And God said, okay. And he shut off the valve. And there was no rain. And because of that, the brook dries up. You see, he's not being punished. His prayers have been recognized and they've been honored. And sometimes the thing we need to understand is to get where God wants us to go, we have to go through the dry brook. Where he wants us to be, we have to go through the difficulty, the problem, and the situations in life that are not pleasant, that are uncomfortable, that we don't like, that we'd like to avoid. But we need to understand that sometimes God uses dry brooks in our lives for a higher purpose because he's working on a plan. He is working with Elijah. He is going to bring about the marvelous battle on Mount Carmel, which follows this, where Elijah challenges the prophets of Baal, and God is going to reveal himself. Elijah, by the way, his name means the Lord, he is God. And when that battle, a spiritual battle on Mount Carmel is over, the crowd is chanting, "The Lord, He is God, the Lord, He is God." They're chanting Elijah's names, what they're doing. But to get there, he had to go through the dry brook. He had to go through the difficulty. And our faith is a tenuous thing sometimes. And dry brooks can be a challenge, whether they're physical, emotional, financial. But God takes us through them. Remember when Jesus came to the disciples walking on the water? They were out in the sea, and the sea was tossed, and Jesus said, "You get in that boat and go to the other side." Now, he didn't make no mistake. He knew the storm was coming, but he sent them right in the middle of it. We need to understand that God has a higher purpose sometimes in our lives. And He is not a God whose purpose, He is a God whose purpose is to draw all men unto Himself, that they might know Him as Lord. And sometimes He has to send His own people through the desert, through the dry brook, through the difficulties, that our testimony might draw people to Him. Sometimes the brook dries up because God's got something better. I guess it's nice to be fed by the raven, but it was better to stay near the home of the widow, where he didn't have to sleep on the ground, where he could sleep in a bed, where he could have a good meal every day made with the flour and the oil. It was better. Now, here's some things to take away from this. First of all, God's a multitasker. Now, I have trouble. I'm getting old. I think I am. I'm not really. If I remembered how old I was, I could tell you if I was getting old or not, but I don't. But God accomplishes many things at once. He's working on Ahab and Jezebel because the drought has come. And God's trying to reveal to them that He is the one true God, not the gods of Baal. Finally, when they are unrepentant, after time and time again, God releases His wrath on them. And that's another story, and it's not a pleasant story what happens to them. But He's working also in the life of Elijah, getting him ready for the battle on Mount Carmel and preparing him and getting his heart ready. But I would submit to you also this morning, He is working in the life of that widow. When you get home, I encourage you to read the rest of this chapter. Since the bin of flour was not used up, nor did the jar of oil run dry, according to the word of the Lord, which He said to Elijah. Now it happened after those things that the son of the woman who owned the house became sick, and his sickness was so serious that there was no breath left in him. So she said to Elijah, "What have I to do with you, O man of God? Have you come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to kill my son?" She said, "I regret I've ever helped you. Look at this. My son's sick and he's going to die. Is it because my sin? Has that been cast upon me because of my sin? Is that what this is all about?" And Elijah takes the boy and takes him to an upper room, and he lays him on his own bed. He cries out to the Lord, and he said, "O Lord my God, have you also brought tragedy on the widow with whom I lodged by killing her son?" And he stretched himself out on the child 3 times and cried out to the Lord, "O Lord my God, I pray, let this child's soul come back to him." Then the Lord heard the voice of Elijah, and the soul of the child came back to him, and he revived. And Elijah took the child and brought him down from the upper room into the house and gave him to his mother. And Elijah said, "See, your son lives." Then the woman said to Elijah, "Now by this I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is true." The oil and the flour had not convinced her. But man, when she sees her son who was dead is now alive, and it is through the God of the prophet, she said, you are the God you are the prophet of the one true God. The word of the Lord is in your mouth. You see what God's done here? He's multitasking. He's working on Ahab and Jezebel. He's developing Elijah, and he's drawing the widow to himself and the son. All at once. Second thing we can learn is in the midst of the dry brook is that our God is a God who hears and answers prayer. He listens. When Elijah said, no rain, God turned it off. When Elijah said, Lord, can you bring the breath back into this child and bring his soul back? God did it. Sometimes some of our best praying is done in the midst of the dry brook, because the dry brook drives us to our knees in desperation. Where can I turn, O Lord, but to you? Who, O Lord, has the answers for this but you? In whom can I trust for protection and provision, O Lord, but you? He draws us to himself in the brook to trust him, and then he waits for us to reach out, and he responds. The widow has found the one true God. Now, I don't know what dry brook you're going through in your life. I know right now, in the midst of everything that's been going on for the last over a year, I've had people come up with problems I've never heard of before. Just everything, from physical, financial, emotional, spiritual. But if you're in the midst of that dry brook, I want you to remember these things. Number one, God uses dry brooks in our lives to draw us to himself. He never shoves us away. He gathers us in. And the dry brook is a time when we should be turning to him most of all and trusting him in the midst of that situation, that he is a God who will take care and will provide, even when the brook is dry. We need to understand and learn those spiritual lessons. We need to understand that he operates in our lives on a need-to-know basis, and he may tell us things or he may not. Read the book of Job one time. I used to teach the book of Job. I really enjoyed that. I taught it for Oklahoma Baptist University Extension. And the amazing thing about Job is he goes through all the things in his family, all his riches, everything. His friends turned out to be a bunch of duns. At the end, when he says, I know my Redeemer liveth, and on the earth one day he liveth, and on the earth one day he will stand secure in his Lord. And God returns to him more than he had to start with, bigger and better things. And throughout all of it, God never tells him why. He never says, here, Job, this is why you're going through all this. He never says to him, here. And I would tell you this morning, in the midst of the dry brooks, we search for answers when we should be searching for God. And we should put our trust not in answers, but in God. And we should say, God, your grace is sufficient for me in the midst of the dry brook. I'm going to trust you no matter what happens. I go in to see the doctor and I get a bad report. I'm going to trust you. I get laid off or lose my job. I'm going to trust you. My family is in a mess. Don't even know where some of my kids are. Lord, I'm going to trust you in the midst of this. Dry brooks are not necessarily a punishment from the Lord. Ahab and Jezebel are punished later, but Elijah's not being punished in the midst of this, working and developing him in his life. So I'd encourage you, when you're in the midst of the dry brook, to trust him more. Don't let the dry brook defeat you. Remember, Elijah was there because his prayers had been effective. In the midst of it all, remember that our God is a God who has a plan. Nothing escapes his attention. And our lives are lived best when we're in the midst of that plan, walking on his path, trusting him. Our Heavenly Father, I don't know each person's life that's watching on.
Thanks again for joining us for another service with Grace Baptist Church. Connect with us using the social media links on our website, gbcevansville.org. We look forward